over time, we start adding things to our life with good intentions, and slowly our priorities start to slip. Things that we know are important, God is first and foremost, but if we're not careful, even under good intentions, we start to let that which is most important slip right through our fingers. Man, today's been a full day. This morning, it started really even several days ago with the construction of the floors, making sure everything was ready to go. The extra cleanup. We had a teen activity yesterday. We had 11 people baptized this morning, 10 more now become members of Grace Baptist Church. It's been a wonderful full day today. And as I was asking the Lord what would be a direction to speak on, Lord, what would you have me to preach on this evening? Just the idea of obedience, of serving the Lord kept coming back. We had 11 people obey the Lord in believers' baptism, and more joined the church wanting to serve the Lord. And as I began to kind of put these things together, the Lord directed me to Luke chapter 14. So if you could turn to Luke chapter 14. And as you turn to Luke 14, when I was younger, growing up, I grew up in California. And growing up, I was blessed, had most of my aunts and uncles and cousins, they all lived close by, and we'd always go over and see them and hang out. I had one particular uncle that I spent the most time with him, and he had a rough past. There was a time where he really fell away from the Lord, got into a lot of stuff he shouldn't have got into. Gangs, violence, drugs, alcohol, I don't know, all kinds of stuff. He hasn't told me all the stories, but he got into a lot of stuff. So when you hear these stories and the way he tries to talk, he comes across as a real tough guy, you know? And even in his days, you know, he got a couple of tattoos up here, you know, he tried to be a tough guy, right? But he's really not. He's just not. He's not. He is when he needs to be, but just... if you just get around, you know him, he's actually a very emotional guy. And it's really fun to pick on him for that. Not that you should pick on people who are emotional, but my uncle is just the one exception. He's the only exception. You shouldn't do it to anyone else except my Uncle Gary. But we used to make fun of him, and sometimes we'd be watching we'd be over at his house or something, and he'd put on a movie. And it'd be some real simple movie that has a really basic storyline. You know how it's going to end when you first watch, you know, from the beginning. Nothing's going to surprise you in this. You know that she's going to get together with him at the end. It's just very typical. Yet, as the climax builds and I'm trying to stay awake, I could look over and I could see my uncle trying to, I look over him, I say, "Uncle, are you crying?" He's like, No, I think someone's chopping onions in the kitchen or something. And he'd make up an excuse as to why he was crying, you know, or he might say, I think there's smoke in here or something. You know, that's got to be what it is. Or anytime he would start getting emotional, he would conveniently have to leave and use the washroom right near the climax of the movie. We all knew what was happening. He had to go grab a tissue. My uncle was a funny guy. And serving the Lord should be our primary focus as a Christian. But as we're about to see, some people find excuses to not serve the Lord. Now, we make excuses all the time, myself included. Some excuses are legitimate. We really did want to have baptisms several months ago, but we had a legitimate reason why the baptistry was leaking. There was a hole, I don't know, but there was water coming out. It was a legitimate reason. I came across this story too. A guy named John L. Jr. back in the 1970s, he once wrote a letter to the IRS in the United States. The IRS is like the CRA of Canada, right? He wrote a letter to the IRS and asked for an extended time to file his taxes. And he gave a reason why. I thought this was a good reason. He says his excuse was that he was in outer space because he was one of the astronauts on Apollo 13. And True story, the IRS wrote back and gave him permission. It gave him an extension of time to file his taxes. What a nice company to do that. They wouldn't do that for anyone else. Apparently there was a clause in the IRS, if you're out of the country, then you're allowed. You have an extension of time. And I guess he fell under that. He was out of the country. He was probably just above the country, but I guess he was out of the atmosphere. So it worked out for him just fine. Some excuses are legitimate, but we know that some are not legitimate. Chopping onions in the kitchen, that's not why my uncle was crying. Sometimes, yesterday, we were at the teen volleyball. We were playing volleyball outside, and I made a few excuses myself. And Brother Patrick, you could confirm, it was windy outside, right? It was windy. There's a few shots I would have normally hit successfully, but it was windy. I don't know, maybe that's a legitimate excuse. I'm not sure. I think I would golf better too if it wasn't windy. Also, if it wasn't hot. Also, if I was just better, I would golf better. Sometimes I heard this excuse once. Sorry, I'm late. I walked into a spider web on the way out of the door, and I had to go back in and take a shower. That's a good one. Sorry, I'm late. My left turn signal was out, so I had to make all right turns to get to work today. That's a good one. I can't use that anymore, though, because I just said it. Sorry, I'm late. I just didn't want to come. Man, there's a lot more. We can make excuses. Some of them are legitimate. Some we make just to help us not look so bad. And sometimes we make excuses as a way to get out of doing something. I can't make it today. I have a thing, you know? Oh, what's that thing? Oh, it's just this really big thing. I just can't do it. I can't make it today. I haven't had my coffee yet. We could make up any excuses we want, sometimes just to get out of something. And we come to Luke chapter 14. And in Luke chapter 14, we see such excuses being made. But before we get there, I want us to consider here, Jesus now in Luke 14, if you look in verse 1, it says, "And it came to pass as he went into the house of one of the chief Pharisees to eat bread." So Jesus in this chapter is sitting at a table with a chief Pharisee. No doubt that the table was filled with other Pharisees of like. He was eating with them. I'm sure his disciples were there as well. They're at this table, they're eating, and while they're eating, Jesus gives a few parables that we find in this chapter. And one of the first parables he gives here is in verse 7. And verses 7 through 11, he gives this parable really, and the focus of it is on humility. He tells them in verse 7, he put forth the parable to those which were bidden, when he marked how they chose out of the chief rooms, saying unto them, and he tells the story, hey, when you guys walk into a room, don't just sit at the best seats of the house. Don't just assume your royalty. Don't assume that you can sit wherever you want. Try to find the lowliest of seats and let the guest of honor tell you where you can sit. If he says, it's okay, come up here and sit by me, that's less embarrassing than him saying, oh, you shouldn't be sitting here. You need to go down there. Because that's what Jesus was saying here. And he was trying to give them a lesson here on humility. And then now look at same chapter, look at verse 12. Verse 12, he continues. He says, then said he also to him that bade him, when thou makest a dinner or supper, call not thy friends, nor thy brethren, neither thy kinsmen, nor thy rich neighbors, lest they also bid thee again, and recompense be made thee. But when thou makest a feast, call the poor, the maimed, the lame, the blind, and thou shalt be blessed, for they cannot recompense thee. For thou shalt be recompensed at the resurrection of the just. Jesus again giving another parable, trying to help the humility of the Pharisees. He's saying, look, don't just make a feast and call your best friends in hopes that now they'll invite you to their birthday party later on in the year. He says, but if you really want to be blessed, invite people to your house that can't ever repay you, that can't recompense. Make the biggest feast you can, the poor, and knowing that there's no way they can repay you for that. Because he says in verse 14, your recompense will come in heaven when you stand before God. So right on the cusp of this parable that Jesus gives, we come to verse 15, which is where our text starts this evening. Verse 15. And when one of them that sat at meat with him heard these things, he said unto him, so this random Pharisee says unto Jesus, blessed is he that shall eat bread in the kingdom of God. So my guess is Jesus tells the story on humility, and the ending phrase in 14 is talking about the kingdom of God is when you'll get your rewards. And I could see this guy saying, yes. He maybe picks up his glass and says, yes, yes. Can't wait to eat bread and the kingdom of God. Almost like he missed what Jesus was trying to say. Almost as if he was just trying to interject and just say something, just to say something. I'm guilty of that myself. Jesus now turns attention to that phrase in verse 16. Then said he unto him, this is Jesus, a certain man made a great supper. Anybody hungry tonight? I'm sorry if you are. That was not my intention. But a certain man made a great supper and bade many. In other words, he invited many. And sent his servant at supper time to say to them that were bidden, come, for all things are now ready. So Jesus is basing this off the illustration he gave before. A man makes a feast, it's all ready, so it's dinner time now. He sends his servants out to bring his family, his friends, his relatives over. Verse 18, and they all, with one consent, began to make, what's that word? What is it again? Began to make excuse. Excuses. That's where we're at here today. A man makes this comment, and Christ joins with this man. He says, yes, it is very true. Blessed are they that shall partake of the privileges of the kingdom, but who are they that shall enjoy these privileges? The Jews, you think you have the monopoly of this, but you will generally reject it. The Gentiles, however, will be the greatest sharers in it. And Jesus here in this example is pointing this illustration and asking the question, what would stop you from serving Christ? What excuses might we give today that would hinder us from serving him? And with this, let's look at the first excuse that was given in verse 18. This is a really good excuse. And they all, with one consent, began to make excuse. The first said unto him, I've bought a piece of ground, and I must needs go and see it. I pray thee, have me excused. So here's the man who no doubt knows this guy well. He has this great feast plan, this big party plan. Everyone's known about it for a long time. And the servant goes to talk and then knocks on his door and says, hey, it's ready. It's time to go now. Yeah, about that. I bought this property and I just really need to go look at it again. So I can't go today. Now, it doesn't sound like a very good excuse. That's because it's a terrible excuse. First of all, consider this. What time of day is it? It's supper time. It's evening. It's going into night. They didn't have street lamps and street lights back then. It's beginning dark. And chances are, if this guy bought this property, he's probably seen it before. He probably knows what it looks like. He probably is already there. He's already bought it. The paperwork's been signed. There's no reason to see it at that moment. Could he not see it the next day? In the morning when it's light outside, when he has more time to prove it, as he says here. It is exactly what it says in the parable. It's just an excuse. And it's not a very good one. This guy simply just doesn't want to go, right? That's obviously the point here. He doesn't want to go. Maybe it's better to just say, I'm sorry, I just don't want to go. But we don't want to hurt anyone's feelings. So we make up things that sound even worse. Yeah, I got this thing to go to. Okay, now I know you're lying. Why don't you just tell me the truth? This man here has something in his life that is preventing him, he's allowing to prevent him from serving the Lord. And in verse 18, I see here, he's using possessions as an excuse. Possessions. He has this piece of property, he bought it, and he's allowing this property to stop him from going to the banquet. Now, Jesus doesn't just tell a parable for no reason. This man here, who has this banquet, represents Christ, and Christ is compelling them, in this case, the Jews, to come, to join him at his banquet. And the point Jesus is making here is the Jews generally are going to reject. But who is it that will come to the banquet? We're going to see that in just a second. This man right here rejects it, and he uses possessions as his excuse. You know, many of us might have some possessions in our life that would prevent and hinder us as well from serving the Lord. Or something we would use as an excuse to not serve the Lord. Something we own. You remember the rich young ruler in Matthew chapter 19? In fact, can we turn there really quick? Look at Matthew chapter 19. We're going to come back to Luke. But look at Matthew chapter 19. Matthew 19, we won't read the whole story, just one verse here. Matthew 19, this rich young ruler comes up to Jesus and asks him, how can I inherit eternal life? And they have a bit of a discourse. They go back and forth, and Jesus says, well, you should do this, this, and this. And the man said, yeah, I do all those things. Of course, Jesus, I do all that. Anything else? And Jesus says in Matthew chapter 19 and verse 16, he says, and behold, one came and said unto him, good master, what good thing shall I do that I may inherit eternal life? So he gives him all these things that he is supposed to do, but look now in verse 21. Jesus said unto him, if thou wilt be perfect, go and sell that thou hast, and give to the poor, and thou shalt have treasure in heaven, and come and follow me. Jesus knew his heart. He knew the one thing he couldn't give up was his possessions. And in verse 22, the young man heard that saying. He went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions. In other words, he says, I can't do it. I can't serve you, Lord. I just have too much. I can't give it all up. Now, you may look at this and say, this isn't fair. Why would Jesus tell him he has to give up everything in order to serve me? I mean, who would do that in their right mind? Turn to Matthew chapter 4, if you can. Matthew chapter 4. A very similar situation happens with a completely different outcome. In Matthew chapter 4, and we come to verse 19. Jesus now is speaking to Peter and his brother Andrew in Matthew chapter 4 in verse 19. We'll start in verse 18. It says, and Jesus, walking by the Sea of Galilee, saw two brethren, Simon, called Peter, and Andrew his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishers. And he said unto them, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. And what happens in verse 20? And they, what's that word? They straightway. You know what straightway means? It means at once. And they straightway left their nets and followed him. Now you would argue, some people would argue, well, they didn't have as much material possessions. Maybe it's the rich young ruler, is easy for them. And that's a valid point. Jesus makes that similar point. It's harder for a rich man to really fully follow Christ than it is for someone who isn't. The more money and wealth you have, the more you lean on it, the more you need it. So there is truth to that. Jesus came, however, to Peter and Andrew. They still did have possessions, and they were willing to give up their occupation, the one thing they probably knew how to do, and they immediately left it right there, and they followed Jesus. The story is told of a prosperous young investment banker who was driving a BMW. He was driving this sedan on a mountain road during a snowstorm. As he veered around one sharp turn, he lost control and began sliding off the road toward a steep cliff. At the last moment, he unbuckled his seatbelt, flung open his door, and leaped from his car, which then plummeted to the bottom of the ravine and burst into a ball of flames. Whew. Although he had escaped with his life, the man suffered a ghastly injury. Somehow his arm had been caught near the hinge of the door, and as he jumped out, part of his arm actually decapitated. A passing trucker saw the accident in his rearview mirror. He pulled his rig over to a halt, ran back to see if he could help. When he arrived at the scene, he found the banker just standing at the roadside, looking down at his car in flames. As the truck driver got closer to the banker, all he could hear the banker saying was, "My BMW, my new BMW." The trucker looked down and noticed something much worse happening. The banker, with adrenaline, didn't know what had happened to his arm. The trucker put his arm on the banker's shoulder and says, "Son, I think you have some bigger problems." And he pointed down to his arm. The banker then looked at his arm and gasped, "My Rolex! Where's my Rolex?" I don't know if the story is true. I hope not. But isn't it interesting how our possessions can really get a hold of us? The more money we get, then the more money we need, right? You want to live a nicer life, so you need a little bit more money. And then you got to maintain that money to live that nicer life. But as things progress and life moves on and things get more expensive, you have to, in order to maintain this lovely lifestyle, oftentimes it forces us to work more to keep up the possessions and these things. It's a vicious cycle if we're not careful. And having possessions and things is not wrong, but when they stop us from serving God, that's when it becomes an issue. Martin Luther once said, "I have held many things in my hands, and I have lost them all. But whatever I have placed in God's hands, that I still possess." I remember when I was 11 years old, when my dad, 12 years old, when my dad felt God calling him to be a missionary. I've told you the story many times. And it was difficult for him at first because my dad was doing well. He had his own business he was running. He owned his own house. He was still young. He had a lot of things going for him, owned several vehicles. Life was good for him. And God calling him to be a missionary meant eventually he's going to have to sell all these things. And had my dad loved those possessions more than God, he wouldn't have been able to do it. But he did. He ended up selling the house. He sold his cars. We kept one, the big one we ended up driving around America in. How often do we let possessions stop us from serving God or the desire to even get them? So in Luke chapter 14 and in verse 18, we see here the excuse of possessions, but there's a second excuse, a second one. So the servant goes to the first guy, and the first excuse is, "I can't come. I bought some property. I got to go look at it right now." So the servant moves on to verse 19. It says, "And another said, I would come, but I have bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I go to prove them. I pray thee, have me excused." So the excuse of possession starts in verse 18. Now in verse 19, we see this excuse of priorities. There's a priority. Priorities are mixed up here for this particular individual. Now, we know that oxen back then you needed oxen. That was your livelihood. Your oxen would plow your field. They could be meats. They were expensive. You had to maintain them. Oxen was a necessity, especially if you were any kind of a farmer. So no doubt this was very important to this person. But were they more important than God? In this particular instance, I believe that the oxen represents the work, the job, the money involved. Because oxen was used to plow, to get food, to work, to provide for your family, to the provisions, to maintain these things. And the priority of this individual here seems to have been his job, his livelihood, over that of God. And this is an easy thing to get mixed up in life. We get our priorities jumbled up a bit here. And sometimes our priorities start out well. We know that God should be first, and we know that family should be way high up on the list. It should be second. We know that church should be high up on the list over all those other things. And we start out with good intentions, but eventually their priorities start to slip, and sometimes we don't even know it's happening. One common example that I've seen that I've seen before, we start out wanting to keep God important. And one of the things, especially as you start to grow a family, is the one thing on my mind constantly is I want to take care of my family. I think that's what every guy, especially those who aren't even married yet, your dream is to get married, have a family, and take care of them. And there's something to be said of that. And of course, I'd love to give them the finest of everything I can, but that's just not the life God has given to me. But I can still give them everything they need. They don't need all these other things. Sometimes we get caught up in wanting to spoil our family. And believe me, if you're able to spoil your family, do it as often as you can. Spoil your wife if you can, as often. With your children, don't spoil your children too much. Got to keep that in moderation. But it brings us joy when we can do nice things for them. And oftentimes a big thing is, and especially this is mostly difficult in the area, in the age we live in, we want to get a nice house for our family. I mean, who doesn't? Who doesn't want to have a yard for your kids to play in safely with a fence? And who doesn't want to see them get out of the house and play with brother and sister? Who doesn't want to see these things take place? And we find a house that we really want, and okay, we got to work hard to get that house. You got to work really hard to get a house in the area we live in here today. We work hard. Okay, in order to get this house, I got to work a little bit extra here and there, and it's okay. It'll just be for a short time. It's for my family. And doing things for your family is good. But sometimes we got to work extra hours, which means missing church here and missing there, but it's okay. It's temporary. Finally, we're able to put a down payment, and we're able to get that house. But now you got to make payments. And we all know nothing is getting cheaper. Things are getting more expensive. And now we have to maintain these hours. Maybe both parents have to work together to maintain bills and to pay for everything. And we get caught up in this sometimes as we're progressing through life. Even we're forced to, especially as both parents have to work full time, we don't get to spend as much time with our kids, and sometimes we only get to see them late at night. It's just for a few hours, and by the time we come home, we're tired, and we end up just kind of crashing, going to bed, and now we're kind of scrambling to even have family time as kids start growing up, and they're good in sports, and they start participating in this and that and this and that, and man, parents' life gets really stressful. We got to work a lot. We got to get our kids, because we love our kids to death, and we do anything for them, and we got to involve them in this and this and this, and we fill our lives with not bad things, they're good things, but over time we start adding things to our life with good intentions, and slowly our priorities start to slip. Things that we know are important, God is first and foremost, but if we're not careful, even under good intentions, we start to let that which is most important slip right through our fingers. And these are just scenarios just to help us realize how easy it is. When it comes to serving God, the devil is really sneaky. And he knows how to get us to do things we shouldn't do, tempt us here and tempt us there, and little crumbs here and little trails here to pull us off the path. Let's be careful. When Jesus calls us to do something, in this case, it's come, commune with him, come to my banquet, commune with me, have a relationship with me, come over to my house, let's get to know each other more. And if we're not careful, we can let some possessions hinder us from really giving our lives to God and getting to know him. We can let priorities start to slip through, whether it's hobbies or it's work, whatever it could be. But then there's a third excuse given. Verse 20. And another said, I have married a wife, and therefore I cannot come. That's it. That's the excuse. I'm married. I can't come. I won't make any jokes about this, but I will say this. Here's an example of somebody who just didn't want to come, right? Couldn't think of anything on the spot, so his excuse was, I just got married. I can't spend a couple hours at your banquet tonight. I'm sorry. Now, of course, this is a parable given by Jesus, so people can try to dig into this and try to dig into the story and add scenarios where maybe they're legitimate. But the point of the story is the word excuse. Jesus is telling the story, and he's saying the word excuse right in there. So there is no good reason here other than this person just doesn't want to come. And what is the excuse he's using? He's using people. In this case, a person he loves. People. Consider, if you will, verse 26. This is in the same chapter. After Jesus is done with this conversation here at the table, in verse 25, he gets up, he leaves. There's a great multitude around him. In verse 26, he looks at the crowd here. The disciples are right there. And he says this, if any man come to me and hate not his father and mother and wife and children and brethren and sisters, yea, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. Pastor Tim, there's a word in there that's really hard. Did you see that word? You all saw that word, right? What's the word I'm talking about? I heard it. What is it? Hate. That's not a word we like to use. That's not a word we use generally. If any man come to me and hate not his father, his mother, his wife, and his children, what is he saying here? This same parable, this same instance is given in Matthew 10:37. This is how Matthew says it. He says, this is Jesus, he that loveth father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And he that loveth son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. The word hate in verse 26 seems a bit harsh in our modern tongue, but it's the same idea used in Genesis chapter 29. Now, I need you to turn here real quick. It's our last verse we'll turn to. But in order to really get a good comparison here, look at Genesis chapter 29. And all the way back in Genesis 29, we see a very interesting situation happen. We come to a guy named Jacob. Jacob is one of the patriarchs. This is Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Jacob is the grandson of Abraham here. Jacob falls in love with a girl. Falls in love with Rachel. But he's deceived here. He loves Rachel so much. Genesis 29, look at verse 18. It says, and Jacob loved Rachel and said, I will serve these 7 years for Rachel, thy younger daughter. He had just been tricked. I'm not going to get into how this happened, but he woke up in the morning. He thought he married Rachel, but he woke up in the morning with her older sister, Leah. He got tricked into marrying Leah instead. Laban said, I forgot to tell you, it's custom in my culture, you have to marry the oldest girl has to get married first. Did I not tell you that? No, you did not tell me that. But Jacob loved Rachel so much, he says, fine, I'll work 7 more years for your daughter. The love was there. Now go to verse 30. Finally, he gets to be married, and now he's married to both of them. Rachel, however, can't have children, but it says in verse 30, and he, this is Jacob, and he went in also unto Rachel, and he loved also Rachel more than Leah, and served with him yet 7 other years. And when the Lord saw that Leah was hated, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. Here's this contrast again. Jacob still, we see, he still had children through Leah. He still treated Leah as his wife, but they both knew who Jacob loved more. Jacob never tried to outcast Leah. He never tried to, but he very clearly made it clear, maybe without even saying it, that Rachel, your sister, is the one that I really love. He loved Rachel more than Leah, and it was very, very clear. And that's the same idea that's taking place here in Luke 14:26. Where is our love today? Is our love in people more than God? We are to love God more than even our own family, and that's a hard statement to make. And it's even a harder one to live. But the closer you get to God, the more in love you get with Him. And loving your family actually becomes stronger. The closer you get to God, the more you love God, the more you actually learn how to love. And the more you learn to love your family the way you're supposed to love. But there needs to be a very clear line drawn that I love God more than my family. What is our excuses tonight? Why we might not perhaps love God the way we should? Have we allowed some possessions to get in our way? Has our priorities gotten out of sync? Has our love even for people, which also is not a bad thing, but has that itself even got in the way of our love for God? In verse 21, Jesus ends by saying, "So that servant came and showed his Lord these things. Then the master of the house, being angry, said to his servant, 'Go out quickly into the streets and lanes of the city, and bring in hither the poor, and the maimed, and the halt, and the blind.' And the servant said, 'Lord, it is done.'" Notice Lord there, capital L, Lord, making clear who the master is. This is talking about Jesus. "Lord, it is done as thou hast commanded, and yet there is room." Verse 23, "And the Lord said unto the servant, Go out into the highways and hedges, and compel them to come in, that my house may be filled. For I say unto you, that none of those men which were bidden shall taste of my supper." Jesus is looking at the Pharisees, and he's going back to his thought. I'm sitting right here in the midst of you Pharisees, and none of you here even believe me. None of you here even do so. However, the Jews in this story represent the ones that he went to and bid and said, "Come." But when they wouldn't come, when they wouldn't listen, Jesus had to go into the highways and the hedges. That represents the Gentiles. I have to go out, and I have to go out and bid them to come. And Jesus was already predicting the unbelief of the Jews and the acceptance of the Gentiles. There is so much more we can discuss. But Jesus is saying, are you going to let excuses stop you from serving me? Because it's easy to do. I heard someone say this: excuses will always be there for you. Opportunity won't. The more excuses you make, the less and less opportunity we have to serve God. And eventually, there won't be an opportunity to serve Him anymore if we keep living our life with the excuse. What's stopping us from having close communion with God. What's our excuse?
Thank you for watching the message today. We invite you to join us again every Sunday and Wednesday for more inspiring messages from God's Word.